All right, I am calling to order the Finance and Administration Committee of the Board of Directors for Marine Water for December 9th, 2021. Our first item of business is to call the roll.
Director Bregman.
Present.
Director Gibson.
Here.
Director Russell.
Larry?
I see his mouth moving. I think he's here. And Chair Kohler.
I'm here. I now need a motion to adopt today's agenda.
So moved.
Second.
Do we have any public comment on the agenda? Terry?
There are none.
Great, then I need a roll call vote.
Director Bregman.
Aye.
Director
Aye.
Gibson.
Aye.
Director Russell.
Aye.
And Chair Kohler.
Aye. Okay, are there any public comments on items that are not on the agenda?
Yes, I have Mr. Rick Adler. Go ahead, Mr. Adler.
Yes, thank you. I understand on the agenda is financing for the Untitled project. I wanted to suggest alternatives to finance for is that would be better spent because I don't think the Untitled project is going to work out. And number one would be the recycling of the wastewater that is poured back into the bay. That's treated wastewater that's semi-clean. And we should use the funding to build a plant to continue treating the water until it's clean enough to be put in for potable use. Number two would be desal, build a plant that desals, but not through the reverse osmosis, which has lots of problems, very complicated, and puts toxic water back into the bay, but to do it through evaporation, the evaporation of heated wet bay water to evaporate and condense into pure water, and that would be powered by solar electricity built on 5 acres of marine watershed that's filled with Scotch broom to put in 5 acres of solar power to finance, to power these projects and all other needs that needs, because the water agency needs lots of electricity to do all its things. And then the third would be catching fog to stainless steel meshes on the ridges, dripping into tanks. Both of these projects are solid state, simple, gravity fed projects that are not like the complicated pipeline or the complicated high-tech, high-pressure reverse osmosis. These are simple, low-tech, low-cost measures once installed that will provide water that's in our area that we produce and control. We don't have to have lawsuits that will affect the Untitled project from the environmental or from the Richmond or from the Central Valley water interests that will stop this project. And so I would suggest the financing be for homegrown, home-operated, home-controlled, simple projects produce more water rather than this pipeline, which is not going to work because, for one thing, when we're desperate for water, the Central Valley will be even more desperate for water, and they will not let any of it go through their pipeline. So the pipeline will become a drain pipe, draining all our money, time, and attention
Mr. Adler.
away. I thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, sir. There are no further comments.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Adler. We're going to go on to our first item on the regular calendar, which is approval of the minutes of the last Finance and Administration Committee and Board of Directors meeting of November 2021. Do I have a motion?
Move approval. Second.
Do we have any board comments on the minutes? Okay. Terry, do we have any public comments on the minutes?
There are none.
Okay, I need a roll call.
Director Bragman,
Aye.
Director Gibson,
Aye.
Director Russell,
Aye.
and Chair Kohler.
Aye. That brings us to item 2, the potential 2022 revenue bonds.
Okay, I'm going to take this one because I have a presentation for you today. Last month, let me share my screen just a moment. Everybody see that?
Yes.
Okay, good. Okay, so last month at Finance, we started the discussion on potential revenue bonds. And during that discussion, we presented some projects that are in our CIP that are not associated with the drought projects and as potential projects for funding. And there were some questions about the board in regards to what's currently funded in our CIP, what's not funded. And so today I'm going to go through our CIP in terms of what we're working on and what we hope to be working on in the near term. So with that, I'll go to the next slide. So first I'm going to speak about historical and current capital improvement projects. This graphic was last presented to the board in 2017, and we have updated it to today, or for fiscal year 2021, ending June 30th. And this is our expenditures on capital investments over the last 10 years. And as you can see, the total is about $221 million over 10 years. Back in 2017, that total was 201 million. So we're averaging a couple extra million a year in expenditures over the last 10 years. And this is funded primarily through our capital maintenance fee. So it's cash funded. And what have we accomplished in the last 10 years? With that $221 million? Well, we seismically upgraded the filters at San Geronimo. We replaced 16 storage tanks. We recoated 9. We replaced 68 miles of deficient pipe. We repaired, as you recall, the Ross Reservoir slide and Porteous Tunnel. Those were both sort of emergency projects that were not initially planned. And, you know, there's many other projects that were accomplished during this time period, but this is just a highlight of some of the top accomplishments. So what are we working on today? With our current CIP, these are projects you don't see until they come to the board for approval and award. So in planning, design, and construction, we have dozens of projects that we're working on, and that is what we spend the bulk of our baseline CIP monies on. And this is just a snapshot of those that are in design for engineering. This does not include projects to repair pipes that break or O&M operations and maintenance expenditures on smaller asset replacements such as pumps, meters, valves, metering pumps. But these are projects that are in the engineering department for design. And we meet monthly with a capital steering group internally to review these projects. And we have Gantt charts and budget reports, and we're constantly monitoring where they are in terms of their progress. So the baseline for pipeline replacements and tank recoatings and other smaller asset replacements is one part of our expenditure, but we also have to plan for the larger projects. Because we're cash funded, we have to spread them out and look at it long-term in terms of 10 years. So these are the projects that we would consider larger projects. Our current expenditure rate for just regular pipeline replacements and renewal projects, it basically eats up about $20 million a year. So we really only have a couple $1 million a year to put towards these larger projects. And when you talk about a $20 million project, you'd have to spread it out over multiple years in order to make the cash flow work for the expenditures. Oftentimes we'll have some reserves and we can use those for the larger projects. But as you know, we're currently utilizing a big part of our cash reserves for some all these drought efforts. So conservation, turf replacement, Castagna, emergency intertie project. Those projects are being funded from reserves right now. So when you see that Pine Mountain Tunnel is funded in the current CIP, I question whether or not we can really have the cash to pay for it now, given that we're spending a bulk of our reserves on the emergency projects for drought. So, but we'll get into this a little more detail in a moment. But these are some of the larger projects that we have to spread out over time. So planning for future long-term capital investments. How do we do that? Well, it started out with the asset management project or effort or program, which we launched in 2018. And as you know, industry standard has you look at the likelihood of failure of a particular asset, the consequence of that failure, and then you determine a risk. So with that, we started to look at what projects were most important to fund in our future CIP. And just to give you an example, these are some of the things you look at for likelihood and consequence. This is a big chunk of our capital expenditure is pipeline replacement. And we found in our asset management review that the 20-year trend for pipeline replacement showed a decrease in the number of leaks that we were experiencing, a 50% decrease. So with that, we felt that, well, we're doing a really good job on our pipeline replacement program. So let's take a closer look at that. Is there an opportunity for us to reduce the amount of pipeline replacement in order to use that money for other projects? So essentially, we came up with a revision of our pipeline replacement rate. The target industry standard is 9 miles a year, which would make a replacement of a pipeline every 100 years, given how many pipelines we have in our system, 900 miles of pipe. But over the last 20 years, we've been replacing it at about 8.1, which is less. And so our pipelines actually have been lasting a bit longer than 100 years. And so we felt that because we've reduced the amount of leaks over time, that we could afford to reduce our expenditures on pipeline replacement to 7 miles a year. Of course, at some point, based on the installation date, we have to increase that back up because our pipelines were all installed at different times. So in order to identify priority projects moving forward, we've had a number of board workshops and meetings to discuss potential projects for funding. It started with the 2017, we released the Water Resources Plan 2040 report. Then we launched our asset management program in 2018. Of course, our urban water management plan came out in June of 2020. And then we had a board retreat in December of 2020 where we kicked off our discussions on a 10-year financial plan. We called that Workshop 1A. In January of 2021, we had Workshop 1B, then March, Workshop 2, and in May, we had Workshop 3. Now in May, that's when the drought was really kicking up and getting into full gear. So we sort of pulled back on our long-range planning workshops with the board at that time. But I'm going to remind everybody where we were back in May of 2021. So we had presented to the board our baseline CIP. So the expenditures that we do on a routine basis every year is about $25 million a year. And then we came up with portfolios or buckets of projects which would increase our annual expenditure in different ways. So we named them the reliability portfolio, resilience, and then contemporary or proactive, where we'd want to pay for everything that we could imagine. So with that, we met with the board at several workshops to discuss the projects that were within each of these portfolios and come up with projects that we felt that were important to fund beyond our capital maintenance fee expenditures. So here, I'm going to go through those projects and what the board gave us in terms of feedback for each one of those portfolios and where we are today. So looking again, there's the baseline, which is that top darker blue category, then reliability, and then what we called resilience, and then contemporary. So we looked at some of the projects that were unfunded. So everything that's in the current level of investment, it was funded, right? So, but we were looking forward at other projects that we would like to do that we just didn't have the funds for. And at that time, back in May, the board gave us feedback that they agreed that Smith Saddle, seismic retrofits of steel tanks and recoating of increasing the recoating rate of our steel tanks was important. Now, how did we come to that decision? We really rolled up our sleeves and went into detail in terms of how we came to these decisions. And I'll give you an example of that. So for storage tanks, we have 75 of the steel tanks in service. And as of today, 31 of them are past due for recoating. And that's based on the industry standard for recoating every 20 to 25 years. And if we were to continue with our current rate of recoating, by the year 2033, we would have 45 tanks that were past due for recoating. So we would actually need to be, based on their installation date, we need to increase the level of recoating to actually just maintain the status quo. And if you look at the fourth bar over to the right, that moving towards resilience bucket was the 12 tanks, the additional 12 tanks that need to be recoated within the next 10 years. The board felt that let's just keep the status quo. We should be investing more in recoating in order to maintain at least the 31 that are overdue for recoating. And that's how we got to that decision. And then we went through each of the asset classes in terms of watershed investments, because our capital projects are split into sort of asset class budgets. And so watershed, the board felt that we should be spending more money on wildfire preparedness, given the history of wildfire in California. And then for pipelines, we looked closely at this one project, the North Marin line, which is a critical pipeline for us in our system that's not funded for replacement, but yet, we felt that it was very important that we do fund it. And I'm going to go into a little detail about North Marin line. That's a pipeline that runs from Kent Lake over to our San Geronimo water treatment plant. It's built in 1957, and it has many creek crossings and culverts that are eroding. And so it's in risk of failure because of that. And so that's a project that we would like to get funded in order to improve the reliability and resilience of this pipeline. And that's a $6 million project that's unfunded. Now, moving into pump stations, given again the wildfire risk in California and what we saw in some of the water districts up north, it was the pump stations that caused supply outages when they were subject to fire. And so with that, the board gave us feedback that they thought we should be investing on structure hardening at a faster rate on our pump stations. So here's an example. For the Hind pump station, it's a wood building with a wood roof. And, in terms of wildfire resilience, that would probably burn down, right, in a major fire if it was in the fire zone. So it would be worthwhile to invest in concrete, blocks and a metal roof in order to improve the resilience of that pump station. But then also we would be looking inside the pump station and seeing if any of the pumps or motors or controls need to be replaced as well. So treatment plants, the San Geronimo treatment plant clarifier replacement project is currently unfunded. As you know, during the Loma Prieta earthquake of 1989, it was the clarifiers that failed at the Rinconada water treatment plant in Santa Clara. And those clarifiers were designed by the same engineering firm. We have identical design, very similar. At least 95% of the design is the same. And so we really do need to do some seismic upgrades and replacement of our clarifiers at San Geronimo, given what we know from case studies of how they performed during earthquakes or failed during earthquakes. And so that's a $17 million project that's currently unfunded. Facilities, capital equipment. We'd like to renew our valve exercising program. And with that are some FTEs and trucks that need to be purchased and some equipment that needs to go with that. And then, because we really do want the valves to work, when they're needed, and if we had a major breaks throughout the system from a seismic event, and not have to move our way up the system to close other valves, which would put more people out of water. So valve exercising is an important component to reliability of the water system. And then you've been hearing a lot about the watershed recreation plan, and that's currently unfunded. We'd like to fund that as well. Water supply. The board felt that we should do increased efforts on conservation, not just program A and B, which was in the last iteration of the Water Conservation Master Plan, but up to level C, which is $36 million over 10 years. And the board gave us feedback that we should be increasing our conservation efforts. Now, we are in the middle of updating our master plan for conservation, so that number may change, but especially based on our current efforts for turf replacement and the costs that we're expending, or the money that we're expending on that. But then also AMI, and AMI is very important in terms of reducing leaks and water demand and monitoring water demand in order to try to reduce demands on our system, especially given that the drought conditions that we're experiencing today. And that's a $20 million investment that's not funded. So when you look at these projects that we felt that needed to be funded, it's sort of a hybrid between reliability and resilience. And we'd need an additional 30, what is it? The difference is $12 million a year over 10 years in order to pay for those projects. Now that's if they're spread out over 10 years. And as you know, it's better to do a project, within a shorter time frame rather than over 10 years. And so that's where bond funding comes into play in order to make the investment today and then spread out the payments over time. So before I go any further though, I want to talk to you about a new project that wasn't on the list of projects that we discussed back in May. And that's the Emergency Transmission System Improvement Project. And this is associated with drought. This is yet to be presented at a public meeting. So this is the first time the public has seen this, but our goal is to increase operational efficiency to realize our contractual import allotments and or additional winter water supply from Sonoma County. So we're looking at flow restrictions within our system and up north, North Marin Aqueduct and even further north. And we're modeling it, we're verifying it, we're ranking those improvements to improve our hydraulic capacity where we have bottlenecks. And so we then are prioritizing projects by implementation timeline and cost. So our operations and maintenance staff, through experience and observations, can empirically show that we have a number of locations within our system that we would consider bottlenecks. So we've contracted with Woodard and Curran to do some hydraulic analysis in our water sim model and to verify these restrictions, and then to model and calibrate with what we see in real life, and then also come up with the capital project that would improve those bottlenecks, and then what it would cost and how much flexibility it would provide us in terms of our ability to move water around within our system. Mm-hmm. So as of today, and this just launched about a month ago, these are the projects that we've got in our preliminary model results. And we'll be coming back to the board in January with more detail. The flow increase and the estimated capital costs are all preliminary and subject to change. But right now we've got a number of projects that we think are very important in order to improve our ability to bring but to move the water from the north down into our system to meet our contractual allotments. And so those projects right now on pen to paper are totaling about $25 million. And so we're still getting that dialed in, and we'll be back to the board in January with more information on these potential projects. As you know, San Quentin, project number 2, is a project that we've been thinking about for some time to improve flow to South Marin. All right, so funded versus unfunded. So these are the projects based on the presentation I just gave you that we feel would be great candidates for bond funding if we were to go out for revenue bonds. And so Pine Mountain Tunnel, given that it's such a large project, we have to spread it out over so long of a time period, would be a good project, a good candidate for bond funding. Smith Saddle Tank, we've discussed that at previous board meetings. We're currently doing condition assessments on that project. Of course, AMI is another project that would be a great candidate for bond funding. And then this new Emergency Transmission System Improvement Project. Okay, so with that, I'm gonna go ahead. Oh, sorry, I didn't realize these were not coming up. I'm going to pass it over to Chuck, who's the board had asked us to come back with what our historical bond issuances were and what our future revenue bond issuance might look like. So I'm going to pass it over.
But this has been a lot. We've been sitting here now for half an hour. So I just want to check in quickly before we move to Chuck to see if the board has any questions about Crystal's presentation. I want to be mindful of the time, and we definitely want to get through the presentation, but I don't want to lose, this was a lot of information. So I just want to make sure the board has time to respond or ask any questions. Anybody? And we'll get to public comment at the end of the full presentation.
Yeah,
I
have a question too. Go ahead.
Are the projects that you recommended for bond funding currently not in the CIP?
Yeah, let me, oops. So here, Pine Mountain Tunnel is, for all intents and purposes, funded, but it's stretched out over 5 years because we only have so much extra capital funds every year. And in fact, we were hoping to use capital reserves for Pine Mountain Tunnel. But as you know, we've been allocating those towards the emergency intertype project. So whether or not those capital reserves are available for Pine Mountain Tunnel is still unclear. So it would be good to bond fund Pine Mountain Tunnel. And then, but the other three, Smith Saddle, AMI, and Emergency Transmission System, yeah, those are not currently funded through our capital maintenance fee. No, there's no funding for those.
Okay, thanks for the clarification.
Yeah. Any other questions?
I have a question. I'm trying to understand the blending between maintenance scheduling prospectively, down the line, how many pipes we replace just because they're old and to be leaking soon, versus emergencies that we deal with from time to time because of time breaks. The numbers you've just showed us, for example, on the 68 miles of pipe, I think it was over 20 years. Is that a mix of both emergency situations, or is that all scheduled piping?
I would say the bulk of our expenditures have been towards planned replacements. The emergency replacements typically tend to be only maybe a 10-foot section of pipe. There's a break in downtown Santa Rafael somewhere. So that represents mostly the larger projects where we're replacing 5,000 feet of pipe in one go on a capital project. Yeah.
And is that explanation pretty much across the board for other than pipe? I mean, pump stations, et cetera, et cetera?
Actually, no. Back in 2013-14, that winter, we had $13 million in landslide repairs, which were unexpected. Okay. So things certainly come along year after year where we have to adjust and delay projects that are planned in order to fix things that come up unexpectedly.
Right. Okay. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
I have several questions, Crystal. You probably have heard me complain before. I don't really like these averages or industry standards. To me, they're basically irrelevant except for planning numbers. Whether a tank is coated every 45 years or 25 years or 35 years or whatever the number is, what we need to know is where do we stand on the tanks we have, not what industry standard is. Like I say, it's fine for planning, but it's not fine for implementing. And similarly with the pipelines, and this is not really a complaint. It may turn into a complaint, but it's not yet. It's very similar to what Mike Bond put forward for years. And, the idea that there's again, an industry standard or a lifetime, it's not irrational by any means, but the materials that we're replacing with, plastic and cathodically protected steel, are going to have longer lives than the old cast iron had. So using the 100-year number for, planning forward, I think is flawed. And I think we need to be very careful here to make sure that we integrate the information we have with what the expected life is, as opposed to what the life of the old style pipes was. Mm-hmm. So, it makes me uncomfortable when I see the same stuff coming back. I think what you're doing is well thought through in terms of the other stuff, But when you get to the routine stuff and then criticizing, saying, you know, well, we need more money for this because this doesn't meet industry standards. Well, maybe that's important and maybe it isn't important. But I think we need to be very careful to look at the material. We have a lot of tanks. We don't have that many tanks. We have a lot of pipe. We don't have that much pipe compared to somebody like East Bay Mud or LA Water and Power. So, you know, it just makes me uncomfortable to approach it this way, which is, like I say, just more of the same that we've already seen. And I think it, you know, and I know you guys are doing more, but I'd rather see more than less in terms of looking at where the leaks are and saying we need to replace this piece of pipe, not because it's 100 years old, but because it has a higher risk potential for leaking. And then I'm all cool with that. Okay. But just saying it's 100 years old and it needs to be replaced, that makes me very uncomfortable.
Yeah, very good points, Director Russell. We certainly do every year when we decide which pipelines to replace. We are looking at leak history, criticality. Is it going to a hospital, for example? You know, how does it the replacement coincide with maybe a pavement renewal project?
Sure.
I mean, there's many factors that go into deciding which pipeline we're going to replace next. And sometimes it is leak history that, you know, we have a pipe that the neighbors have been out of water 5 times in the last 5 years because we've had leaks every year. And so, you know, that's something we definitely address when we schedule our pipeline replacement work.
Sure. So going forward, what I think would be more useful to us is like I say, to come back with a list of the tanks and say, this one needs it, this one needs it, this one needs it, not to say that the coating is our average is X, because I just don't think that cuts the mustard. It may be right on, but clearly average for Phoenix, Arizona, and the sun damage there is much different than an average here. And
certainly we also still have some redwood tanks that are leaking, you know, gallons per minute that need replacement. So sure. But, you know, I mean, the redwood tanks are a special situation. They may be leaking gallons per minute. That's true. They may be putting color in the water. That's also true. They may even support coliform bacterial growth. But, you know, they have served us well. And I'm not particularly keen on just replacing them because they're redwood, you know, which is basically the philosophy that's been used. I mean, somebody said and made these decisions in the 70s or 60s when the tanks were put in, knowing all these limitations, and they overrode them going forward. You know, we're putting in steel tanks, and especially bolted steel tanks, which have their own set of problems with respect to maintenance, like coating and recoating. So, you know, again, I hear you. It's I think, a little more complicated than that. All very good points. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Any further board comment before we move on? Okay. I want to move on to Chuck's piece of this about our bond history. Thanks.
Okay. All right. We'll go on to the next. All right, Chuck, just tell me when to change.
Yeah.
Oh, and one more thing. Can we get these slides?
Yes.
We have
at least
them.
I couldn't find them. We have them?
Terry sent them.
Okay. Not in my set.
No,
I saw the Chuck slides.
Yeah, I only sent the financial monthlies. I didn't have these slides either.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay.
We'll get them posted.
Thanks.
Well, thanks, Crystal. You won't have to do much slide changing. I have one slide here. So Crystal just addressed the big issue that came out of our last discussion, and then another question was asked about how often we go out for debt financing. So we just put together the schedule for you, and the rows that you see there in green are times that we've gone out for new money. So we did that in 2010 with revenue bonds. And then 2017, we went out again. Prior to that, we'd gone out in 2002 and 2004 for new money bonds. And then the other bonds that you see here are refunding bonds. So the 2016 refunded the 2010 bonds. 2012 refunding took out those 2002 and 2004 certificates of participation. And then you are familiar with the 2022 forward refunding that we just did that we will make the first payments on this coming year. So that
Chuck, I'm sorry. Before the 2010, you said we went out in 2004 and one other time?
Yeah, so if you see this under the purpose column here, Chair Kohler, you'll see refunds 2002
I understand.
bonds.
I'm saying before 2010. I do understand what new money is. I'm asking before 2010.
Yes, these bonds here, the 2002 bonds and 2004 COPS were new money bonds. So we refunded those with this 2012 refunding.
Okay.
So it looks like roughly we go out about every 7 years for new money bonds.
Or sometimes more frequently as it appears. Right?
Yeah, looks like your new money bonds were 2002, 2004, and then again in 2010 and again in 2017.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you're right. The 2002, 2004 was within 2 years of each other.
Yeah, and then 4 to 10 is 6. So it's not super regular, but it's also, you know, not once in a lifetime.
No, absolutely not. And there's no reason that they're spread out like this. I don't think, you know, you can bond as much as your capacity will allow you to. So.
Okay. I think that's really helpful for us to know. I think there's been a bit of a perception that there's only one bite at this apple. And is it fair to say, Chuck, from your perspective, that what really limits us or is an opportunity for us, first of all, is need, but also, you know, what our debt coverage ratio can reasonably bear?
The coverage ratio is going to drive a lot of what this is, you know, but if you issue bonds and then you increase rates to cover that debt service cost, you're not going to affect your coverage too much. The other issue that's going to affect you a bit is that there's obviously a lot of fixed costs with issuing these bonds. So we have to pay for bond counsel and
right.
Our MAs and all those kind of costs. So you're generally going to try and get an economy of scale with these and wait until you have a sizable issue.
Yeah, I definitely see that. So what we're considering now, I'm just looking at this, is much higher than what we've done before. Or what I should say, what management is proposing. So can you talk to that for a minute?
Well, and again, it's back to the need and what started this discussion really is that intertype project. And I don't think we've ever had a single need that large before. Usually these,
right.
If you go back and look at the description of what these bonds funded, it was, you know, several projects, many projects, and they range from water projects to watershed projects. So,
except Chuck, when we looked at the desal, we were looking at bonds of this magnitude for desal.
Yeah.
So today our goal was to really focus, well, to respond to the questions, including this slide, but primarily to focus on the projects and have the board appreciate the nature of those projects and the need and the basis and the history of them. So once we kind of confirm the direction with the emergency drought projects and where we need to for the intertie to go out for debt, were we moving forward with that? At that point, we'd bring back some alternatives to the board on, do we want to incorporate some additional projects in that debt offering or not? So we just wanted to take this opportunity to fill in some of the gaps.
Okay. I'm also interested, Ben, in how this would fit into our capital management fee, how it would affect that rate. And that's
right.
why I was asking about whether any of these projects were previously included, because that would offset the increase from the debt financing. So I think that's something else that the board is going to want to at least have a general idea about the effect on that rate, the CMF.
Right. So generally what we're looking at in these set of slides would be the approach, Director Bragman, of maintaining with the modest construction index, the CMF, and that would be used towards our current CIP, our planned replacement, our cyclical projects, and these large one-off kind of one-time projects like AMI, these hydraulic pinch points, Pine Mountain Tunnel would be funded through debt service, which would be in addition, we'd have a debt service payment in addition and beyond the CMF. Not that that's where we'll end up, but that's kind of the context of this presentation.
Right, and I'm just wondering, wouldn't it be appropriate to include that bond financing, those bond financing payments in the CMF? So they would,
that is absolutely an alternative. We would need to look the size, assuming the Intertype project, the size of this bond offering could take a very large chunk out of the CMF, but we could do it based on our kind of, when we set up the CMF, we did allow it to pay for debt payment. So we could do it, and we would have to show to the board what in the CIP would not get done, right? It's a fixed pie.
Right, but I'm also suggesting that we might have to increase the CMF.
Right, that's another path as well.
So that would be something I would like to at least understand. If we were just going to increase it to handle the debt financing,
I see.
That little percentage increase would be, or the monthly increase would be. So it just seems to me customers or residents do have an understanding of infrastructure. You know, it's become a much more widespread issue now with the Build Back program, one that was recently passed. I'm not sure what they call it. So I think folks do understand that we're sort of at a inflection point on infrastructure. So I think to the extent that we can keep it all in one sort of it might be just from
okay, we'll bring that analysis back next time.
Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah, I think the key thing, you know, Cynthia's correct. You know, we have gone out before, but the key thing is the part that Chuck mentioned, which is, you know, bonding is tagged directly to rate increases in order to maintain the coverage. So, you know, that's the part we need to keep in mind, is that these each have a cost of doing business.
Right. And with our CMF, though, we vastly increased our debt coverage ratio. So that
absolutely,
that actually worked out pretty well as far as our financial, you know, rating is concerned. So what I'm saying is, if we keep it all bundled in that same basket, you know, we might be able to keep that positive debt coverage.
Right. Sure. But of course, it's just a different form of rate increase, huh?
I think that point, Director Bragman, is really important, that if the board had not developed the CMF, we wouldn't be able to have these discussions of funding this emergency drought project. I mean, it really shows the wisdom of developing the CMF to address the debt coverage.
Yeah, I think it does too.
Yeah, just remember, guys, that, you know, we're getting pushback, at least some pushback, about the fixed portion of our bills versus the variable portion. Absolutely. So, you know, it's a good idea, and I don't have a problem with it. I've been the one that's pushed that the hardest. I think is you may not have heard, Larry, my airplane club story, but you will, about how we rationalized the airplane club by just dividing the fixed costs by the number of members, and, you know, and that was the new monthly fee, right? Instead of having to scramble every month for people to fly,
right.
It just, right. Yeah, it's the same thing we have. It's exactly the same thing,
right?
You know,
right. And it kind of makes sense, actually, because it doesn't matter how much water you're pushing through the pipe, you still need to replace the pipe, you know, or whatever.
Exactly. Or have the treatment operator or have management or whomever, right. You know, the just fixed costs of doing business.
Right. So the blended approach is probably the fairest, which is what we're using now.
Absolutely.
Exactly. Yeah. I'm less concerned than you are, Larry Russell, about pushback. I think it's a loud voice from a very small number of people. And, you know, I've actually been spending the last couple of weeks meeting with local leaders just generally to get their take on what's going on with the district and the drought and our options. And I've actually had 3 separately tell me that they've had, you know, they've had people come to them to try to complain about the board. And each of them has said, nope, the board did exactly the right thing. We need to be covering these costs. So you know, we need to hear from everybody, but I don't think we need to overreact to folks who are, I feel comfortable saying, misguided, and feel that, you know, we should be working at extremes. It is never going to be in the best interest of our ratepayers to be doing only one thing.
Couldn't agree more. And, you know, I'm totally comfortable. I just, you know, want to make sure we're all on the same page, that actions have reactions.
Yeah, no doubt.
Yeah. Okay. Do we have any further board comment on the presentation? All right, Terry, do we have public comment on the presentation?
Yes, we have a few. Laura Epple, then Ed Jameson, please, in that order. Ms. Epple.
Thank you. I noticed that Director Russell said he didn't have access to the slides about the capital projects before now. Well, the public didn't either. How do we get access to those slides, the ones that were just shown? Can I get an answer to that? I know you don't.
All of our material will be posted. After every meeting, we ensure that everything's posted, and most often we do post in advance, but this particular presentation will be posted immediately following the meeting.
All right, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Jameson?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. I'd just like to reinforce what Director Russell said. He's the only really quantitative person on this board, and I think people need to listen to him carefully. I listened to or observed the last meeting last month, and my recollection is we have plans to put a 5% increase on pricing as a baseline. The baseline plan for capital additions on top of the baseline was another 4 or 5% a year, as I recall. I think you're talking about a few additional items here that are going to push those numbers up even more. The bottom line is there's no evading very large price increases each year to fund these capital projects, or I should have said the bond projects. If we do the $100 million pipeline, we're going to be down at about 1.32, as I recollect, or thereabouts, on our debt coverage ratio that's required. It can't get below 1.25 before terrible things happen. We're talking about packing a lot more capital improvements in from these lists. I suspect a lot of this is from insufficient maintenance in the last two decades or so. That's probably no one's fault here, perhaps. But with a shortfall on past capital project maintenance and replacements, to talk about putting another $36 million, for example, into so-called conservation projects, which still remain unidentified. There's no way you can do cash for grass and chew up $36 million, although we're apparently trying with $3 a square foot this month. And then on top of that 36 million, another 20 million. I'll also add that the 36 million was solely, I believe, in response to Ms. Kohler's comments. And she accounts for, by my guess, 90 to 95% of the verbiage in these meetings. Somehow this dysfunctional board needs to do more polling of the other 4 members, and they need to understand how these numbers work. Assuming that these cash or price increases can just be shoved down your users' throats year after year with more and more increases, I don't think is realistic. On top of that 36 million, the AMI project went from like the 4th tier, lowest category before last month's presentation, now up to like the number 3 project I recollect seeing for $20 million. And again, I think that was Ms. Culver, but perhaps there was a wider support for that among the board. But you were just packing more and more pie in the sky ideas into these things. And we don't have the rate capacity to absorb all this stuff. And thinking that you can float bonds forever to cover it is not realistic. The rates are going to go zooming up high. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. And our next speaker is Mr. Roger Roberts. Go ahead, Mr. Roberts.
Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Yes or no?
Yes.
Yes.
We're talking big numbers. And I appreciate today's presentation. And I know the board is going to respond carefully in prioritizing the capital investments that are abundantly necessary for the water district. And I would urge you, as part of your presentations in the future, is to share what the impacts would be on water rates and start to prepare the public for what is a necessary water rate increase to bring your capital projects forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Roger.
There are no further public comments.
Okay, I think I just want to double check that we're done with board comments before moving on to our next agenda item. Okay, then we're moving on to the monthly financial update.
All right, thank you, Chair Kohler and directors. Can you see my screen?
Yes, sir.
Okay. This will be the monthly financial report for the month of October. So we'll start off with revenues. We are 1/3 of the way through the year, so everything tracked linearly. We'd be right at 1/3. And surprisingly, you can see water revenues are at 33% of budget. And we'll talk about that.
Chuck, we see your preview screen and notes. Can you switch it to full screen? It's hard to read, small font.
Yeah, sorry. Is that better?
Yeah, that's good.
Great. Okay, so as I was saying, so we're right at 33%, and we'll talk about the timing of that here on the next slide. But essentially, those water revenues you see there include the water sales, service charges, and watershed management fee. And you can see the breakout of this if you look at attachment 3 in your package. And then the other revenues, those are things like rents and grants, interest that we get on the portfolio, and that's about 31% of where we'd expect to be. So again, right on. So total revenues are $29.2 million, right at about 30% of where we should be for the year. Then the fire flow fee that we get via the property tax rules, we'll see the first slug of that come in next month for the December remittances. So that will come to about 50% of where it's supposed to be. And then our capital revenues are right about at 1/3 of the year, which is again linearly where we'd expect those to be. And then we break this down for you to show you the different components. So you've got the water sales, the service charge, and the watershed fee, those two components being the fixed fees there. And water sales, as I said, are at 33.5%. Ordinarily, most of our sales of the commodity net us about 45% of our annual revenue that's budgeted through October. So you can see actually we're actually a bit behind, and that's to be expected given the conservation efforts that we've undertaken. Actually, if you look at attachment 1 and you can see the actuals for previous years, you'll see that compared to last fiscal year, we're down by about 27% in water sales. And then the two fixed fees, the service charge and the watershed fee, track pretty much linearly with budget as you'd expect as those fixed fees. And then we kind of slice this another way just to show you, this is in thousands of dollars, how we are looking in monthly water sales. So these bars here are including those three components you saw on the previous slide, the commodity charge plus meter service and watershed maintenance fee. And you can see that that we're down pretty substantially in every month of this fiscal year starting July. And you can see there, as we talked about the timing of our revenues, you can see that August and October are ordinarily our highest months for revenue collections or water usage. And both of those have had substantial decreases in usage. October, keep in mind, we also had 18 inches of rain in October compared to 0 inches in the previous 2 Octobers. So that also drove down some of the demand for water. And also keep in mind that in this red bars, which is the previous fiscal year, that was a COVID year, which tended to cause higher water sales, higher water usage. And then we look at our savings overall. The bottom line, the total, we're down about 24%. And this is now looking in volumetric measurements and acre feet. We're down 25%. And as we showed you last month, same trend that we're seeing, most of that savings there, 27% down in single family, down over 1,700 acre feet for the month of October compared to the previous year. And then irrigation likewise is down almost 40%, again, as you would be expected with the conservation efforts. So we're seeing a lot of decrease in demand for water. And then tier consumption, you can see how we've looked since 2015. This 2016 bar is the last time that we had a drought. And you can see how that compares to this year. They're almost identical in the volume of water used. This is in acre feet. And you can see substantially the same drops in almost every tier. The interesting thing here is that actually tier 1 actually dropped by about 4% when we look back at the last drought. But the other tiers remain pretty much the same in experience as to what we saw in fiscal year 2016. And then we break out AMI data each month so we can get a more real-time look at what's going on. So this is 1,175 meters in the Tiburon Belvedere area. This is only Resi Code 1, so that's single-family residence only. But there you can see a very large drop of 40% in this October compared to the last October. The previous month in September, we had a 30% drop compared to year over year, and then 28% drop in August. So again, this gives you a real-time look at what people within the Tiburon and Belvedere area are doing, and we're seeing substantial reductions in water usage there. And then we look at a smaller sample size when we look at the institutional business meters. This is for the entire district, but it's only 82 meters. But again, you're seeing pretty good decreases of about 19% in October. And then you had about 18% reduction in September, about a 21% reduction in August. So again, we're seeing those same trend lines here. And then we'll turn to the expenditures. So personnel services, it's right about what you'd expect. Again, keeping in mind that if we were tracking exactly with the budget, we'd be 33%. You're always going to be a little behind budget in personnel services just because we have some static vacancy rates. Maintenance and operating expenses, we're right about that 33% mark. We're a little bit over, and if you look at your attachment 3 in your package, you'll see a breakout of the expenditures, and there's a couple of areas where we are tracking ahead of budget. One of those is insurance. You know that our premiums went up quite a bit this year. We also pay our insurance premiums though in July, so we're at 100% of budget in that category. And then the other area where we're almost at the 100% of annual budget is in conservation, and you know those reductions in water are largely due in fact to us putting a lot of extra money into conservation. And then finance costs, those are right on with budget just because we artificially spread those across the year, although we make payments generally biannually on those. And then the capital allocation, which is the portion of labor that we allocate to capital projects, is tracking with budget right at 31.2%. And then we look at some of our capital expenditures. Fire flow projects are about 15% of budget. And then the district projects, which are those projects, the capital projects, and then equipment purchases, we're at about 18%. But as we started doing lately, we kind of do this reconciliation. The capital, we really have to look at what's encumbered. So we have things like the generators, I think it was over $3 million that's been encumbered. So those really should be included in the cost. So when you add those in, those capital encumbrances, we're at about 35% of budget overall. And if you just include our capital expenses and those capital encumbrances, we're at about 40% of budget. Again, a little bit ahead of that 33% when you're tracking at the fiscal year that we expect. And then finally, we look at the reserves. Our restricted and designated fund remains right about $20 million. The rate stabilization reserve fund, we'll talk about that in a little more detail here in a moment. That's gone from 9.4 million at July 1st down to 3.6 million now. And that's as of October. That's actually decreased a little more since then. Fire flow fund is at $2.1 million. Pension reserve fund, we haven't touched. That's at $2 million. And the capital fund's healthy at $26 million. And then the operating unrestricted fund, what we generally refer to as our reserves, that's at $23 million, and that's come down from $32.6 million at the beginning of the fiscal year, July 1. So operating fund balance to budget in months, we have 3 months worth of fund balance to cover. Debt coverage is projected 2.1. Outstanding debt remains at $139.3 million. We'll make our first payments, I think, this month. And then other debt, the smaller debts like Las Colinas are $6.9 million. And then just to kind of give you a reconciliation on those reserves. So the top portion here is the rate stabilization fund that I showed you began at $9.4 million. And then the bottom portion is our unrestricted fund or reserve. So that $9.4 million is decreased down to $3.6 million. You can see that a lot of that is over $4 million that we put into the Untitled project, put $500,000 towards Castagna, Peacock Gap recycled water transmission, about $150,000. And then we transferred $1 million out to the contingency in the operating fund there, so transfer in. And then drought-related costs, about $700,000, about $600,000 in the water conservation rebate program. And then to backfill those shortfalls of revenues that you're seeing, that almost 30% decrease in revenues, we've used $9.36 million. So if you add these two together at July 1st, we would have had about $42 million. And as of October 31st, 1/3 of the way through the year, we're down to about $26.6 million. So that gives you an idea of the rate of burn. Again, all of this was planned for, and this is what we're seeing exactly what we expected to see here. So in summary, as I showed you, the drought is definitely impacting revenues. Our expenditures, generally speaking, are tracking with budget, including on the capital side. And as expected, our reserve balances are declining. And that is the end of my presentation. Anyone has questions?
And I'm going to have to turn the end of this meeting over to Jack, I believe, because I am late for my next meeting. I don't have any questions, and I just want to thank Chuck and the staff for their presentations.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, I guess, are there any other questions for Chuck here?
Yeah, I'd like to say something, Jack.
Yeah,
that was an excellent presentation, Chuck. I thoroughly found it satisfying in terms of information. Thank you.
Yeah, same here.
Yeah, I agree, and I think the same for Crystal. I thought Crystal's was excellent as well. Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah. All right. Do we have any questions from the public?
Yes, Mr. Roger Roberts.
Okay.
Good.
Roger.
Let me unmute. You can hear me now, I presume.
Right.
Yes.
Yes, sir.
You're fortunate in having reserves to burn through. And it looks to me like you've only got 3 or 4 months left of burn left before you're going to be in dire straits. So I think it's time to move this forward and replenish the reserves as part of the funding that you would anticipate with the bond issuance. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Interesting comment, Roger.
Okay. Other public comments?
Yes, Mr. Rick Adler.
Okay, Mr. Adler.
Unmute, sir.
Okay. Yes, thank you. I was wondering if there's, has the calculations been done to see if we could issue new bonds at these historically low interest rates to pay off the older bonds at higher rates and get a savings that way? Consolidate all the old bonds and pay them off with a new one at a much lower interest rate. Has that calculation been done? Is that a possibility?
We're already doing it.
Yeah, it's been done. Yeah,
good idea. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
It's been done. What is it? Been refinanced?
We have a bond. Yes, we've refinanced. We have a bond that kicks in 2024. There's contractual relationships in the bonding. As soon as it can be done was 2024.
Okay.
We don't quite.
You can't call the bonds at any time. You can only call them when they're callable.
Okay.
So that sets it 2024.
Yeah. Yep. I see Chuck nodding his head, so he's obviously in agreement with that. Any other questions?
There are none.
Okay. I think that's the last item on our agenda. So with that, thank you all very much, and we'll call it adjourned.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Later.
Very much, everybody.
Bye.